Right. Hello, everybody. My name is John Ross. I'm going to be chairing today's event. And I want to thank you for attending this online conference, which is sponsored by No Cold War, the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, and Chonyang Institute for Financial Studies, Renmin University of China. I'm a senior fellow at Chonyang Institute and also a member of the organizing committee of No Cold War. As today we will have audiences from both China and the so-called West, I will just briefly introduce the sponsoring organizations. Chonyang Institute is one of the most important think tanks in China, with research which is influential with the Chinese government, with social organizations, and with a major presence in the mass media. Tricontinental Institute for Social Research is an influential Western research center, particularly focused on Asia, Africa, and Latin America. New Cold War is a campaign established by well-known figures in the West and China to oppose a new Cold War. For New Cold War, this is an exciting event, as it's the first one to be broadcast simultaneously in Chinese and English, thanks to Chonyang Institute. In January, we'll be holding a Spanish language event. As promoting dialogue between China and the so-called West, particularly the United States, is one of our key goals. Therefore, it's very, very good to have for the first time a simultaneous English and Chinese translation. I'm sure that we will hear a range of analyses of the situation following the US presidential election and the de facto election of Biden. I aim to be strictly impartial in chairing, but I will also explain my own view about this situation. I would like to be able to say that with the defeat of Trump in the presidential election, no Cold War can now wind up as an organization, as the Cold War will come to an end. But unfortunately, that would be inaccurate. Forces in the US committed to a new Cold War are influential not merely in the Republican Party, but in the Democratic Party. In some parts of the world, it's already clear there will be no significant change in US policy at all. In Latin America, the aggressive policy towards Venezuela, Cuba, progressive Bolivia, and other countries will continue. That was why we thought it's so important to ask Oli Vargas from Bolivia to change. There is no indication whatever from Biden that there will be any change in policy towards Latin America. Towards China, my own analysis would be that Biden will continue an aggressive policy, but with different tactics. That is, I think that the dispute between Trump and Biden is not a pure fake one. It is a real choice in orientation, but only of how to confront China, not whether to confront China. Obama attempted to create a broad anti-China coalition, to which he therefore was willing to make certain concessions towards US allies. Trump changed this back to America first, in which other countries had to supply resources to the United States. Biden, in my judgment, will probably switch back to the broad anti-China alliance. So the Cold War will continue under Biden, but possibly with different tactics. We should note, of course, that Trump or Trumpism is not going to disappear either and will continue to be a factor in the situation because Trump received 70 million votes and therefore this is not enough, in my judgment, to shake his hold over the Republican Party. So there will probably continue to be this different differences in tactics on how to deal with China between what we may call Trumpism and the Biden presidency. On other key issues, for example, Iran and climate change, there is an important discussion to be had, and I look forward to hearing people's analyses of this. Anyway, but that's enough of my views. Let's hear from our wide-ranging speakers. Could I remind all speakers that they have 10 minutes and I will have to interrupt them if they go over it because we've got to fit everybody in. The first speaker will be Wang Wen. Wang Wen is the Executive Dean of Chonyang Institute, and he's going to present the report, an analysis of US New Cold War policy, which has been drawn up by Chonyang Institute. Therefore, I look forward very much to hearing his report. Floor is Wang Wen's.
Okay, thank you, John. I'm so glad to see you again and again. And also thank you, Mr. Martin Jia. and also Mr. Vijay. So because of you, both of you and also Mr. John Low's support, four of us cooperate and publish our four articles, long articles in a very famous Chinese academic journal, the Northeast Asia Forum. This journal is one of the top three international relation journal in China, and which has a very great influence on Chinese academic circles. And so today, four of us will share our views, our visions about the new Cold War, and also not only in China through a lot of very important platform simultaneously, and also on the YouTube platform. And I know Martin and John and Vijay, you will share your views. So I would like to just share my views on new Cold War about the research report. Just a very brief 4 points. First is so-called because we all know that the American election nowadays is generally over finished, and Mr. Joe Biden will be win over 99%. But we look at the last 1 year, nearly 1 year. They both of them, Mr. Trump and Mr. Joe Biden, they wanted to play the China card, but now we can know that so-called China card planned by the two presidential candidates did not work. It's in particular President Trump. So every day President Trump criticized China. He tried to divert voters' attention from his feeling to fight the pandemic and hoping to create an enemy of China to unite the American society. And China, on China's side, China is not fooled. China did not become the #1 topic before the election day. We all know, right? The first topic in the past 1 year in the election process is the new coronavirus and the personal scandal of the two candidates. And China has not launched a first battle with the US. Instead, it has reacted politely, and it's not willing to lead the focus of the American public opinion. At the same time, there are too many domestic problems in the US, including political infighting, economic recession, social disintegration, and race discrimination, and out of the control of a pandemic situation and so on. There are a lot of problems, domestic problems in the US. So this fully shows that the general election strategy of playing the China card has failed, right? That's the first point I want to share. Second point is that President Trump's strategy of trying to find a new Cold War with China also failed. According to the 4 standards of the definition of the Cold War in the international academic circle, they are first, all-round confrontation. Second, ideological opposition. Third, 2 camps. And the fourth, the decoupling of the economy. But at present, till now, the state of the China and the United States is far from the new Cold War. Despite Trump every day pointing at China, China has maintained restraint, except for the foreign ministry forced response. Chinese leader, including our President Xi Jinping and our Prime Minister Li Keqiang, have been silent to the US. So this is not to dare, but to have some strategic thinking and not to fall into a new Cold War. So instead, China has been calling for cooperation between the two countries. So and also, fortunately, the two societies have been cooperating. The trade between China and the U.S. in the last 10 months, growing year on year, better than that in 2019. And the count of the capital IPO raised by Chinese company going to the US, going to New York for listing in the first 8 months exceeds the total amount in 2019. And the US assets such as Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan also have more holdings in the China's financial market than in 2019. So behind this lies Chinese strategy of comprehensively deepening reform and opening up and the attraction of the China market. So I think that China society level and the US society level, we cooperate very deeply, more than last year, more than before. That's the second point I want to share. The third point I want to share is that, yes, we prepared. We have a psychologically preparation. China-US friction will become the new normal in the next 10 years or more. So I call it competition and cooperation. And China has made adequately psychologically prepared, as I said. And China can understand American anxiety because China economic growth, China rise up very, very quickly. And a lot of think tank and institute, they estimate that maybe in 5 years or in 7 years, at most in 10 years, China's GDP will surpass US. And but the problem is that time will prove that China don't want to replace U.S. leadership. So I think that some scholars they often use Thucydides trap to copy the game between China and the United States. Want to describe the relationship between China and the U.S. Sorry, okay, and but I think for the United States, rather than worry about the China rise leading to the decline of the U.S. Sorry, yes, okay. And
could somebody mute? Could everybody make sure they're muted because they're interrupting Wang Wen? Thank you.
Okay, yes, okay. So I think it's better for United States. It's better to reflect on why the United States have been engaged in foreign wars for 90% of the time since its founding, especially in recent years. So I think that if we remember that in 2015, President Xi Jinping visited the United States. He said we should all try to avoid falling into the Thucydides trap, and the idea that a powerful nation can only presume hegemony does not apply to China. China has no implemented the gene for such an action. I think this sentence is very, very important. President Xi Jinping promised we don't want to replace the United States. But I think this is a very, very important statement. That's the third point I want to share. Fourth point, last but not least, is that in the future competition between China and the US is how to govern their own country and meet the needs of their people for a better life. That is the competition for domestic governance. If we look at the last 1 year, nearly 1 year, China tried our best to control basically, fundamentally the pandemic spreading, and only in 2 months. Nowadays, China basically recovering our daily life, the Chinese. But look at the United States, over more than 200,000 people have died, more than all the war's deaths since the World War II. So I think we should focus our domestic solution, both of us. Nowadays, if my foreign friends know, China just last week, China has passed and finished its 14th five-year plan and set a long-term goal for 2035 in the coming 15 years. And in the context of this plan, I read all the documents of the 5-year plan and also the long-term goal for 2035. There are no any special mention about the United States. Instead, in the documents, they focus on the domestic fields such as economy, society development, and people livelihood, and science, innovation, and technology development, and security, something like that. About the foreign policy, the documents expressed the idea of the opening up with a high quality and building a new type of the international relations and promote the construction of the community of shared future for mankind. No any mentions about US. This is true. Very long document, very long draft. So I think it can be seen that in the views of the Chinese decision maker, it is not China established strategic goals to compete with the US. If it is necessary to construct a future of competition between US and China, the key to who can win in the competition in the future is not to create a new Cold War and try to win, but also who can better create a better society and help the world build a better future. I think this is a key for the future competition between China and the US. And for me, China think tank scholar, I will try my country to promote the social development and also help the world build a better future. I think if we can do it, China can do that, we will win for the future. And not we don't want to have any new Cold War with US. So this is my part of my research report and my views on new Cold War. Thank you again and again. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, my foreign friends. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Margaret Kimberley, who's the next speaker, is we're very honored about this because one of the most positive things which existed during the previous Cold War was that there was a very important dialogue between African Americans and China. W.E.B. Du Bois was a guest at the National Day celebrations of China. Malcolm X praised China on many occasions. And Muhammad Ali visited China, and that during the periods of defeats that for 1980s and 1990s, this link unfortunately became weaker. Margaret spoke at a event, in fact, the founding event of No Cold War on the 25th of July. And her speech went down like a bomb in China, I can tell you. The last time I looked, it had 360,000 views on video. So we're highly delighted to give Margaret the floor of representing Black Alliance for Peace. That's for you, Margaret. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Greetings, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to return to a No Cold War webinar, particularly in the wake of the recently held presidential election. As of today, the vote count's not yet over, and but we do believe that Joe Biden is leading. We know that Joe Biden is leading in the Electoral College, and President Trump's path to victory is much more difficult. Biden is the likely successor. This change in presidential administration brings with it inevitable questions about policy changes that will impact the rest of the world. Change is desperately needed in the wake of the many disasters that Trump and his foreign policy team have wrought. But there's more consensus than there is difference among the duopoly in the United States. There is a bipartisan, pro-war orientation that continues uninterrupted, and I believe we will see this dynamic play out again. First, we have Biden's history as a senator for more than 30 years and 8 years serving as Barack Obama's vice president. Biden was always among the most right-wing, most hawkish of his party in the Senate. He's among those who supported the 2003 invasion of Iraq and later advocated that the country be partitioned. He belatedly called his vote a mistake when it became obvious that this particular intervention had lost popularity. Biden served under a president who changed the intervention scenario in one very important way. Instead of sending troops as George W. Bush had done, Obama preferred to use proxies to destabilize targeted governments, and he did so in Libya and destroyed that nation. He attempted to do the same in Syria, a policy which continued under Trump. Obama sided with far-right Ukrainians, some of them neo-Nazis, in that country's internal dispute in 2014 and drove an elected president from office. Ukraine became a de facto US colony, and Biden acted as a viceroy, who even got his son a well-paid position at a Ukrainian gas company. Biden also served in office during the so-called pivot to Asia, when the Obama administration began a period of open US hostility towards China. As a candidate, Biden's attacks on Trump have come from the right wing. He and other Democrats criticized the effort to overthrow the Venezuelan government only because they have failed to dislodge the elected president. Would-be usurper Juan Guaido is not just celebrated by the Trump administration when he comes to Washington, but by Democrats too. During their second presidential debate, Biden reduced the leaders of Russia and China and North Korea to the label of thug. Trump's talks with DPRK's Kim Jong-un were disparaged as worthless and even dangerous. Trump and Biden competed with one another in a bizarre game of one-upmanship as to who would be tougher on China. The country blamed for the coronavirus pandemic, yet the one which has made the most progress against the disease and the only one to prosper in spite of it. There is another indication that the doctrine of intervention, proxy wars, and sanctions will continue. The military-industrial complex is a powerful force in American politics. The CEO of Boeing, one of the largest defense contractors in the country, made clear that he was comfortable with either man being elected. He said, quote, "I think both candidates, at least in my view, appear globally oriented and interested in the defense of our country, and I believe they'll support the industries. I don't think we're going to take a position on one being better than the other," unquote. Why would he want to do that when he knows that both parties will do the bidding of Boeing and others of its ilk? We can see the connection between the military-industrial complex and the government through campaign fundraising. An example is Paloma Partners, a hedge fund which contributed nearly $10 million to the Biden campaign. Paloma has 260,000 shares of stock in Raytheon, another defense industry giant. Can you hear me? Raytheon is a major weapons supplier to Saudi Arabia, and its CEO was equally unperturbed by the election outcome. When the Trump campaign claimed that Biden would cut the military budget, the head of Raytheon declined to criticize, as he said, "Defense has always been a bipartisan issue." That is an understatement. These hedge funds investing in Boeing and Raytheon and Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas and so on utilize political action committees which can make unlimited contributions, and they do so liberally to both parties. There is no reason to question Biden's alliance when the people who give him money tell you there is no reason to even ask the question. Imperialism is bipartisan, and it also has a revolving door of people who were Obama administration officials who are now advising Biden and will no doubt accompany him back to the White House, the State Department, and the Pentagon. They pen essays in Foreign Affairs magazine calling for China to change in some way that America would like. Democrats and Republicans urged good relations with China when they overwhelmingly approved a vote supporting China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2000. Senator Joe Biden was among them. According to the New York Times, this is what Biden said at that time. Quote, permanently normalized trade continues a process of careful engagement designed to encourage China's development as a productive, responsible member of the world community, unquote. Mr. Biden also predicted that Delaware's chemical and poultry industries would benefit, as well as General Motors and Chrysler, both of which operated major plants in that state. Of course, deindustrializing the United States was also a bipartisan project. As long as China manufactured cheap goods, the relationship was cordial. But now China is an economic powerhouse, building infrastructure projects around the world and competing with the US for influence. Donald Trump has destroyed diplomacy between the two countries as he has closed the consulate, banned TikTok, WeChat, and other platforms, as well as Huawei phones for use by American consumers. Biden hasn't opposed any of those moves. I believe that it is foolish to try in divine intention when Biden calls Xi Jinping a thug and joins the chorus of condemnation about non-existent concentration camps in Xinjiang. We must take him and his advisors at their word. The US economy and indeed the entire capitalist world are in the midst of a severe crisis. They can't compete with China, so they seek to intimidate and undermine that country. There's no reason to believe that Biden will act differently after declaring open hostility. Presidential elections provide illuminating moments, snapshots in time of a country and its people. But it pays not to listen to claims of peaceful transfers of power and the beauty of the American experiment and other such cliches and platitudes. Biden's transition from free trade lover to hawk against China tells us all we need to know about him and about the United States. When he and others speak of China as a competitor, trying to undo what they caused themselves and not knowing how to reverse the course of their country or how to bend powerful nations to their will. Biden will surely bring Obama holdovers from their holding places at think tanks and university. They will probably be more polished than Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who thinks that maximum pressure and boorish insults will win the day. But style is not what counts. They don't give money without anticipating that they will also have influence. They don't build planes, helicopters, and battleships for show. Ultimately, they build them to be used, and that is never good news. Biden has already said that he will renew the New START nuclear agreement with Russia. He gives a less than ensuring impression about other countries that the Trump administration has unilaterally broken agreements with. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, popularly known as the Iran nuclear agreement, is one where Biden has made conflicting statements. He says he will restore it, but only after Iran proves that it never cheated. Of course, this was a signature achievement of the Obama administration, but fealty to Israel will make it difficult to pursue rebuilding what Trump tore apart. That is how American politics works. It is rare for the acts of one administration to be undone by the next. Dangerous policies continue because they are all on the same page. We can only hope that China's leaders and leaders of other countries targeted and smeared have better judgment than their American counterparts. Whether the US president is named Bush, Obama, Trump, or Biden, they all bear watching because they all leave a bitter legacy for the rest of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Just one little note for people. Could people make sure that if they're not speaking that they are muted, because there was some interruption of Margaret, and I thought she was brilliant to keep speaking through it, but so others don't have to deal with it, can they please check to be muted? The next speaker is someone who has practical experience of being in the United States. That is Hei Wei-wen, who's the former counselor at the Chinese consulates general in both New York and San Francisco. So he has experience both of China and of the United States. He's also a senior fellow at Chonyang. So Hei Wei-wen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. It's my great pleasure to attending this great conference and meeting so many eminent speakers first time. As everybody knows and shares the same opinion that the 2020 US presidential election is certainly the focus of world attention, because it has great implications not only on American domestic politics and economy, but also had a strong implication to the world. And although the final results are still pending, it's almost certain that Joe Biden will win out. Of course, barring anything unexpected happen. There might be something else happen, but generally speaking, Joe Biden will be the winner. So, of course, if Trump succeeds for his second term, he will continue all his existing policies towards China and the world. Towards China, he will continue the staunch hostile policy and the Cold War mentality on China. And the China-US tensions will continue. And to the world, he will still pursue American first, prevailing over the world multilateral mechanism, creating great difficulties for the world. So if Biden wins the presidency, will there be a fundamental change? My understanding is no. Of course, there will be changes, 3 changes. First, Joe Biden says he supports multilateralism. He has declared that under his presidency, the US will return to Paris Accord and return to WHO. So if we both China and US pursue multilateral rules, it will be easier for China and US to handle their differences and also oppose the unilateral tariffs, because it hurts the American business interests. And if that happens, that would be good. Second, Joe Biden has claimed that the number 1 danger for the US is Russia, not China. And China is the number 1 rival of the US. So therefore, he looks almost ready to maybe they open some room for dialogues with China and for managing differences instead of the Trump administration abrupt unilateral actions without any notice, without any consultation. However, although he will not pursue a Trump-type Cold War relationship, he will still pursue a Cold War in general relations with China, which I will elaborate a little bit later. Third, Joe Biden will try to repair the tensions with the US allies, especially European countries. Currently, Trump, in many cases, when fighting China, he is doing by his own, because many European companies are not standing with him. So if Biden improves the relations with the European allies and checking China collectively, especially in technology and national security, that will be bad for China. China will be faced with more difficulties. No change, like the Republicans, the Democrats are also hostile to China in general. Large numbers of the Congress bills involving China have been initiated or strongly supported by the Democrats. Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, was especially hostile to China national security law in Hong Kong. The new constitution of Democratic Party dropped the one China policy. That means they will support Taiwan independence. although they will not, whether they will do it really is another thing. However, they dropped one China policy. The phase one trade agreement with China done by Trump administration was severely blamed by the Democrats as not hawkish enough to China. So the US position, the policy on China's Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang issues will remain the same or even more hostile. So in conclusion, Joe Biden presidency will bring some changes. However, the general tensions between China and the US will remain. A new Cold War will not disappear. In global arena, if Joe Biden wins the presidency, there might be some positive moves in multilateral cooperation regarding fighting COVID-19, Paris Accord, Iran nuclear accord, and appointment of new Director General of WTO, hopefully. So however, we should be fully prepared that the general tension, the general situation will not change fundamentally. China is should be prepared for all the eventualities in dealing with the tensions with the United States. I think the basic position of China is not to argue this and that on the concrete issues, but upholding the United Nations Charter, which puts the equality of sovereignty for all nations first. That means key issue tackling China-United States relations should be the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. China and United States have to coexist peacefully. The first principle is mutual respect of sovereignty and territorial integrity. So both Hong Kong and Taiwan are part of China's territory, not the US territory. China will only fight back resolutely on these issues if they provoke China. Second, mutual non-aggression. As Taiwan is China's territory, if the US armed forces land on Taiwan, there will be aggression on China. Thirdly, mutual non-interference of internal affairs. There have been long arguments, long accusations from the US, says blaming China's Communist Party's leadership and blame the socialist system and blame the ideology in China. But all these are China's internal affairs. We never tell the United States whether to use this or that, use this system or not that system, because that's internal affairs. So China, the fourth principle is equality and mutual benefit. On the above mentioned, the 3 principles, China will continue to seek business cooperation with the United States. Fifth, peaceful coexistence. Without the 4 principles, there will be no peaceful coexistence. So regarding the decoupling prospects, we say that the Cold War is based on decoupling because if you decouple supply chain, decouple economic relations, there will be easy to have Cold War. So regarding for decoupling prospects, we are confident that the US decoupling with China effort will fail. According to China official trade data, during the first 9 months of 2020, total Chinese export to the US was already 3% higher than the same period of 2017 before the trade war started. And Chinese exports during Q3 of 2020 was 10% higher than the quarterly average of 2018, which was the highest in history. So during the first 7 months, the US business added 860 new investment enterprises in China instead of decoupling with China. So we should oppose resolutely any new Cold War mentalities and policies. At the same time, we should seek cooperation, especially the business community, to lay down a good foundation for a small keeping relations between the 2 countries, so as to contribute to the peace and stability of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that, and that's both a Chinese and experienced US view of the situation. The next speaker needs very little introduction either in the West or in China. Martin Jakes' book, When China Rules the World, was a bestseller both in the West and in China. So I'm sure everyone will be very interested to hear his views, and it's not necessary for me to say anything more. Right, thank you. Over to you, Martin. You're muted, Martin. Martin, you're muted. You need to, oh, fine. It's okay. Right.
Apologies for that. Well, thank you very much, John, for that introduction, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me to speak at this webinar. I'm not going to talk about the relationship between China and the US in any great detail. I would say I very much agreed with Wang Wen's comments at the beginning about this, and also what Wen Wei has just said. Biden has, it would seem, won the presidential election, but only by the narrowest of margins. Trump won more votes than any candidate in history, apart from Biden in 2020. The Republicans will, in all probability, continue to have a majority in the Senate. The Democratic majority in the House of Representatives was reduced. This was a victory for Biden in not much more than name only. Trump will continue to seek legal ways of preventing Biden assuming the presidency, and in the process, casting doubt on the legitimacy of the election. In his final 11 weeks in office, Trump will fight a war of resistance, seeking to make things as difficult as possible for Biden. He will appeal to his base, probably hold rallies around the country, and begin the campaign to undermine the Biden presidency. This will be like no other presidential handover in American history. Trump will refuse to acknowledge in any shape or form that he has lost. He will convince a large proportion of his supporters that the result is illegitimate. Biden will be an extremely weak president, able to do very little. Domestically, he will depend on support from the Republican majority in the Senate, which means at the very most, he will be able to deliver an extremely diluted version of his plans, and for the most part, nothing at all. He will have more room to maneuver on foreign policy, but our expectations when it comes to China should be extremely minimal. The American turn against China was bipartisan. The Democrats were no less hawkish than Trump. Indeed, historically, they have been worse. Biden will probably be less aggressive, a bit more accommodating, but not much. And he will be constantly accused by the Republicans of being weak on China. The bottom line of this election is that America is hopelessly divided and deeply polarized. After 4 years of Trump, his lies, his racism, his disastrous handling of COVID-19, his demonizing of China, his implicit support for the far right, the electoral dial barely shifted. The status quo ante continues. There may be a different face in the White House, but in practice, hardly anything will change. America is stuck, divided down the middle. The chasm between the two halves of the electorate getting ever wider. The two less and less able to communicate with each other. Each sees the other as the enemy. These kind of divisions are toxic, very difficult to reverse, and spell great danger for America. Why? How did America get to this? The reasons are very deep. America is a remarkable country. From more or less its inception, the first settlers and later independents, America grew relentlessly for over 2 centuries, with barely an interruption. There is no other country in the world that can compare with its record of growth in the period between 1800 and 2000. The idea of America as the land of opportunity, that it could achieve the impossible, was rooted in this historical transformation. It gave birth to the American dream. But nothing is forever, though Americans thought it was. From around 1980, American economic growth began to weaken. The crucial turning point came a little later, in the first decade of this century. The disastrous wars in Afghanistan and Iraq shook faith in the American establishment and the confidence of Americans in their global reputation and standing. And then, most crucially of all, came the 2008 Western financial crisis, homegrown in America. Many Americans had experienced more or less stagnant incomes, if not contracting, ever since the 1980s, which led to a growing sense of dissatisfaction. The 2008 crisis further hit wages and jobs. Economic growth fell to its lowest level for many decades. Several polls have shown that Americans no longer expect their children, when they reach the same age, to enjoy similar living standards. They will be poorer. This spells the end of the American dream. America is no longer the promised land. 2 centuries of optimism about the future have given way to pessimism, anger, and angst. The result of all of this was the rise of Trump. 6 years after the financial crisis, he was elected president. There are 3 things that I would like to emphasize. First, there is the extraordinary speed of the change in America's mood. Less than 20 years, or perhaps depending on how you date it, a little more than a decade. America is struggling to come to terms with a huge change in its fortunes. Half the population has suffered more or less static or falling incomes for 2 or 3 decades, and the country's international influence has greatly declined, largely because of the rise of China. Second, the fact that a political leader like Trump, who is so radically different from all his predecessors, who has abandoned America's post-war foreign policy, who displays such strong authoritarian predilections and is openly racist, is a warning that America is now impossible to predict. Third, there is zero possibility of a return to the status quo ante. The world in which America lives has changed profoundly and irreversibly. America has changed as a consequence. America is now a different country. What does this mean? For sure, we don't know America's future. We are in new territory. The polarization will surely get worse. The tensions will grow. Biden will likely be a one-term president. Trump or someone worse, perhaps, could be elected in 2024. What will happen to American democracy as we know it? Will America act in a way that threatens world peace? What, in the longer term, will become of America? Such apocalyptic questions are no longer hypothetical. America is unstable and unpredictable. Its future is unknown. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, Martin certainly gave a broad historical perspective to what we are discussing. That should enable us to put other things into perspective in that framework. Okay. The next speaker, Vijay Prashad, is one of the nicest experiences for people to meet him during the No Cold War campaign, because so many people have read his books before, but it's very nice to be in touch with him in the flesh. He's one of the most wide-ranging writers on the world in the West, and it's great to have his views on the dialogue in the situation with China. So therefore, over to you, Vijay.
Thanks a lot, John. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be with my friends and colleagues from China and around the world. Much will certainly change in the world of US foreign policy when Joe Biden enters the White House. There will be a more measured tone, less reliance upon Twitter to announce policy, and less of a direct attack on the administrative state, or what Donald Trump calls the deep state. The general foreign policy orientation driven by Trump of America first will no longer be part of the rhetoric of the presidency, although even this is not entirely clear. Trump has certainly put the question of the direct self-interest of the United States on the table, something which Biden will not be able to ignore. There was something particularly brusque about Trump, illustrated by the way he shoved aside Montenegro's Prime Minister Duško Marković at the 2017 NATO meeting. Biden might not push and shove his way to the front of the group, but his silvery smile will camouflage as ruthless a set of aims. The framework to analyze the distance between Trump and Biden has been seen through a deceptive dichotomy. Trump is described as isolationist, with his America First policy seen as a stance toward the world that suggested that he wanted to take care of US domestic policy first before stepping out into the world. But this doesn't account for Trump's aggressive posture against Cuba, Iran, and Venezuela, with his heightened illegal sanctions policy against these countries. It does not explain his total fealty to the Israeli project to annihilate Palestine, nor does it fully explain his so-called trade war against China and the creation of new international mechanisms to prevent China's relations with other countries. Whether these mechanisms be the Millennium Challenge Corporation or American Crèche, which are commercial, or the pressure to break with Huawei, which has a mafia edge to it. None of these policies strike me as isolationist in any way. It is also misleading to call Biden an internationalist or a multilateralist. Biden will prosecute the same kinds of policies with a facade of alliance building, particularly with the United States' European allies. Trump, in his 4 years, and Biden, in his almost, 4 decades in public office, have been committed to a policy that seeks to advance the self-interest of the ruling elites in the United States and the self-interest of the transnational corporations domiciled in the North Atlantic states, whether it be in the United States, Canada, or indeed in Europe. They differ in their strategy, but not in their motive. Trump believed that the alliance system with the European countries was not as effective as it should have been, while Biden will try to strengthen the alliance system or that particular alliance system. But it is not as if Trump did not build alliances. The Quad with Australia, India, and Japan, along with the United States, was a substantial international alliance used to put pressure on China largely by military means. It is just that the alliances and his strategies that Trump used were different. The motive to maintain US primacy and to prevent the growth of genuine global democracy remains the same, as does the beneficiaries of their policy, the ruling elites in the United States and in Europe, as well as the transnational corporations that these elites control and benefit from. One stunning fact: during Trump's trade war against China, not one US Silicon Valley CEO has made a robust public statement condemning the war. Many of these CEOs are liberals, many of them otherwise quite hostile to Trump on cultural or ethical grounds. But none of them, not individually or as a group, decided to write an opinion piece asking for a dial down of the trade war, since so many of them relied upon China for their manufacturing. When Tim Cook of Apple had his summit with Trump in August 2019, he made it clear that Apple's manufacturing in China suffered against Samsung because the South Korean company was not paying tariffs. There was no broad statement against the attempt by the United States to push back against Huawei and ZTE. This is largely because Silicon Valley firms know that on certain key technological developments, such as 5G, Internet of All Things, robotics, GPS, Chinese firms have clearly produced next generation technologies and in many cases leapfrogged over US firms. These firms, these Silicon Valley firms, want the US administration, whether Trump or Biden, to use the entire weight of the state to give them an advantage. This includes using the security apparatus to accuse Huawei of being involved in Chinese government espionage. It is a curiosity that none of the Silicon Valley firms worry about privacy per se, because according to Edward Snowden's revelations, the National Security Agency uses the PRISM program to collect data freely from Silicon Valley internet firms. But they use the privacy and espionage arguments to try and hurt Chinese tech firms and protect the intellectual property and market advantage of Silicon Valley. Since this is the real cause of the trade war, not merely to advantage US steel firms, but also Silicon Valley, there is every likelihood that Biden, by the way, has said so, that his administration will continue to prosecute the trade war. China's Belt and Road Initiative, which was set up in 2013, was met by the Obama and Biden administration with the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2015. The TPP was set up explicitly to try and break China's commercial relations within Asia. Trump jettisoned the TPP and went for a more direct trade war. Again, the strategy was different, but the motive and goal are the same. During the Bush administration in 2004, the US government set up the Millennium Challenge Corporation to provide aid. Use of this grant in both Nepal and Sri Lanka has clearly been seen as a way for the United States to undermine the Belt and Road. Now the US government, with bipartisan support, has created the Growth in Americas, or American Crèche, to try and undermine Chinese business interests in Latin America and the Caribbean. This connection has been made very explicit in El Salvador, for instance, where the United States and Japan have directly told the government of El Salvador not to sign an agreement for the upgrading of a port by a Chinese company. Once again, there is bipartisan support for the use of these instruments to undermine the Belt and Road Initiative. There will be no let up on this pressure. Liberal commentators say that Biden will be more internationalist or more multilateral. Evidence for this is offered in Biden's pledge to return the United States to the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran deal, and the 2016 Paris Agreement, or the climate process. The United States will not come back to these treaties to develop a multilateral process. This return to the Iran deal and to the Paris Agreement is entirely premised on Biden's priority to rebuild and consolidate the North Atlantic or Western alliance system, which has been eroded by Trump's attack on European underfunding of NATO by his withdrawal from the Iran deal and from the Paris Accord. Biden returns here as a show of faith. Let's be clear that the United States under Obama did not enter these deals to advance a multilateral process. The United States entered the Iranian deal because the Europeans were desperate for a source of energy after the United States destroyed access to Libyan oil after the NATO war of 2011 and to Russian natural gas with the Ukraine conflict in 2014. Obama agreed to the 2015 Iran deal because the Europeans were desperate not to line up with the demands of international law. Biden will give the Europeans this gift. On climate, the United States watered down Paris, but will return to the table only to give the appearance of multilateralism. The fact is that Biden will want to subordinate Europe so as to better confront China. A Biden presidency based on this reading of the record of the United States relations with China over the past 20 years will not calm this United States imposed hybrid war, this Cold War on China. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vijay. Right. Now, our next speaker is our second speaker from the United States, Claude De La Cruz, who's Executive Director of the People's Forum in New York. It's very good to hear, not merely from the position of the United States, but as I mentioned right at the beginning, one place which has had a long cold and unfortunately sometimes hot war, quite often hot war with the United States, of course, in Latin America. And Claudia is of Latin American heritage in the United States. So I'm really looking forward to hearing her views about this. Over to you, Claudia.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you so much to the organizers of the event for putting this very important conversation together. Conversations around the new Cold War and the hybrid wars that are developing from the United States are very important to have in this current context. And so, as you mentioned, the People's Forum, I am a community organizer and educator who shares collective spaces of work with other organizers and social movements through the People's Forum and also the Popular Education Project. And we have been following the electoral process and elections on a basis of what these will mean to our ability to build a strong and unified movement that is anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-racist. And I would like to share some of the reflections and some of our analysis from the perspective of social movements in the United States. What we understand are some of the challenges and possibilities, what we consider some immediate tasks to be for organizations and people seeking systemic and structural change in the United States, and folks that understand also the need to build relationships of solidarity and collaboration with sister nations. You have all mentioned the tense situation that we are living currently in the United States, the fact that the entire country and many around the world are waiting anxiously on what the outcome of this election will be. One, because we know that Trump, as a result of neoliberalism and the imperialist hegemonic, the deep racism, the xenophobia, the patriarchy, the anti-democratic, the nationalist, far right, and all the ugly and evil values that make this oppressive and exploitive system what it is. And still, 70 million people in this country voted for Trump. Not a number to be easily dismissed. Secondly, because we know that this imperialist project of war and occupation and extraction, for many around the world, is important to keep abreast of the situation because it's a matter of livelihood, it's a matter of the empire, which has utilized all its forces at all times to be able to subordinate and dominate. Margaret previously shared, the two parties are essentially in lockstep when it comes to imperialism. As it concerns to China and Russia and Venezuela, Democrats and Republicans are enthusiastically promoting more sanctions and more aggressive policies that could lead to war. So although tactics may change, the strategy continues to be one of war in its many forms. And we must be clear about that. So the question for and from social movements becomes, how do we utilize this moment to advance the struggles of the majority of the people in the United States, the poor and working class? How do we strengthen organizations and unify movements? And how do we cement and promote values and projects that stand against war in all its forms in the United States and abroad? At this moment, it seems very unlikely that Trump will succeed in his attempts to continue in the White House. The corporate media and some sectors of the ruling class have abandoned Trump. We could see that because when we turn on Fox News yesterday and we see all the folks debating and talking and are standing against the positions of Trump, that's telling for an outlet that has been mostly pushing Trump's agenda. It's important to understand that he has openly attacked one of the sacred pillars of the capitalist system and its state. He has worked intensely to delegitimize the political system of the United States, which has served the ruling class to govern the majority of people. And so these attacks towards the political system and its institutions represent a threat to the ruling class. The overturning of millions of votes or support to Trump at this moment would mean that tens of millions could adopt a more revolutionary attitude towards the status quo. Also, if Biden wins, Trump has created the conditions for fascist and ultra-right groups to take the streets. The United States ruling class does not want destabilization in the streets, in their economic system, and in their political system. And so they will do whatever they can to try and stop that. Currently, there is a very broad anti-Trump coalition that is being led by the Democrats and its economic and political machine. The call is to count every vote, which is most definitely a call that is supported by the many. People want to believe that their vote will count, although we know that in the United States, popular democracy has never counted, right? The Democratic Party is not calling into question voter suppression. They're not calling into question the lack of participatory democracy. And it's not on their best interest to do so because they've also participated in voter suppression. They have also pushed forward policies that become obstacles for the participation of the people. And many of the most damaging policies for the working class in the last 30 years have been led by the Democrats. And so it's a huge challenge for social movements in the United States in thinking about building unity and strengthening mass movement when the Democratic Party has placed its economic and political structure in the process of absorbing the social unrest that went on beginning in May with after the attacks to George Floyd, the folks that have been protesting around mass evictions, the folks that have been protesting because of lack of employment, like all this social unrest has been somehow absorbed by the Democrats. And it's a huge challenge for, again, social movements to be able to strengthen and unify and build an actual movement that can birth a political vehicle outside of any of the two wings of the ruling class political system. And it's a huge challenge, but it's not impossible, right? And I think we need to be able to look at the nuances to understand that it is possible for us to do it. It might take a while. Historically, and in this context, as I was saying, progressive sectors and social movements have been subordinated to the democratic wing of the bourgeoisie. The labor movement, many NGOs, nonprofit organizations who have a base have been absorbed by the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party understands this and is taking advantage of this scenario to gather the strength and advance its agenda under the banner of all united for a better future. And so Democrats, again, are identifying leaders in the grassroots, are identifying folks that could carry the message in this political context. Black women, Black youth, brown young men, the historically marginalized, the leadership that could be potentially leading the masses in another way are being also absorbed by the ruling class. It is important to consider that although this is a tight race and obviously with high stakes, there has been an unprecedented number of voters taking the tolls. And those who are voting for the Democratic Party are not necessarily, and this is where I think the light is at the end of the tunnel, they're not necessarily voting for the Democratic Party, and they're not necessarily voting committed to the agenda of Biden and Harris. They are voting against Trump. This is a vote against fascism, is a vote against racism, is a vote against xenophobia, is against all the things, again, that I mentioned before are representative of an exploitive system. And it's you know, as we know, the Democratic Party will not resolve in any way, shape, or form the issues related to employment, the issues related to housing, to healthcare, to student debt, and the deepening of the economic crisis, because we will see that, right? We see that Wall Street will continue to work based on speculation and creating bubbles. And those bubbles will continue to burst, and people will continue to lose housing. We will continue to lose employment. And so it's coming, and it's important from social movements, from organizations, to prepare for the more subtle ways in which imperialism and capitalism has learned to govern, and where many are becoming more and more aware in the United States in the ways in which the system works, the oppressive mechanisms that it utilizes. We're talking about a post-COVID USA. We're talking about unprecedented, exorbitant unemployment rates. We're talking about post, you know, the past 8 months, where people have actually seen the racism, the blatant attacks coming from the state and its institutions. And so it won't be easily
Claudia, could you just bring you're taking your speaking time. Could you just bring your remarks to a close?
I'm sorry. I couldn't hear. Oh yeah, sorry. So sorry. So sorry. So wait, so just to close, we expect more attacks by the state of social movements and political organizations. We expect different tactics coming from the Democrats, but the strategy of war will continue. We're estimating that at times of great upheaval and social mobilizations are coming. This will require those intensified struggle. We know that we are strengthening the anti-war movement through the connection of working class struggles at home and abroad. We must connect the economic war against poor working class in the United States and working class folks in China and Cuba and Venezuela. The use of militarization in Seattle and New York, with the occupation and militarization in Palestine, the tactics utilized against people in Chile, and the backing of popular elected governments being overthrown around the world. And so there's a lot of work from social movements. And I guess my biggest message is that, yes, these are moments of intense scenarios politically and socially. I believe that is also hope in the changing of the national consciousness and the politicization of new era of willing to fight for structural and systematic change and the destruction and the abolition of what capitalism is and what imperialism has meant to the world. And sorry for expanding.
Okay, right. Thank you very much indeed. Okay. People have heard some harsh judgments here about in China about some people were surprised by the harshness of US response in the new Cold War to China and the attack. One place in the world which has no illusions on this is the situation in Latin America, of course. The attention of the world was focused obviously on the US presidential election, but not long before there was another extremely important election in which there was a real genuine victory. This was in Bolivia, in which after a de facto military coup, the people through mass activity succeeded in re-establishing democracy, and winning. The movement for socialism won the electoral victory there. This was a very important thing. If I could make a remark, I think that in China, insufficient attention is paid to the situation in Latin America, because for a long time, Latin America was seen as the backyard of the United States. But now we have many forces in Latin America that are both not wishing to be the backyard of the United States and which want good relations with China. In reporting these events in Bolivia, nobody played a more outstanding role in getting out the news about what was really going on than Oli Vargas. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce him to here. The floor's yours, Oli.
Thank you very much, John. I hope you can all hear me okay. We've been extremely busy here in Bolivia preparing for an event that certainly for those of us here is of equal, certainly more significance in US elections, and that is the return of Eva Morales to the country. He'll be returning on Monday, and we'll be there to cover the event for Monday through to Wednesday, finishing here in the Tropic of Cochabamba, where he was a union leader and where he led the movement, the successful movement against the US military presence in this region, the presence of the DEA and of USAID here in the Tropico. Of course, I'd like to speak about the issue of Latin America and how this plays into it, because of course the future of US and China relations has implications for everyone around the world. And I certainly share what most speakers, especially those from the US, have been mentioning, that there is, of course, bipartisan consensus and continuity in terms of hawkish, aggressive, imperialist foreign policies from both Democrat and Republican administrations. And certainly Latin America knows that very well. Certainly the people of Honduras know that very well. And the role of they know very well the role of Hillary Clinton in promoting the right-wing coup there that's still not been defeated in the country. The people of Colombia know very well the role of Joe Biden in drawing up Plan Colombia, something that has created the sort of security state, the paramilitary state that exists today, and which claims the lives of numerous social leaders, indigenous leaders in the countryside every single week. And of course, Evo Morales himself will have very clear memories of how the Obama administration interacted with Latin America. It was under the Obama administration that Evo Morales expelled the USAID, the DEA for interference in the internal affairs of the country. And it was under the Obama administration where his personal plane was stopped in Switzerland, not even in the United States, but in Switzerland by US officials, because they believed Edward Snowden was on his flight, which subjected Evo Morales to a humiliating stop and search, as if he were not an elected head of state. So we know that there has been a level of continuity through Democratic administrations, through to Republican administrations, in terms of an aggressive colonialist foreign policy. However, we have to also recognize that took a sharp turn for the worse under Donald Trump. So while the Obama administration began the regime of economic sanctions in Venezuela, under the Trump administration, we saw them take the extraordinary step of de-recognizing the elected government and imposing a new government that had no control over any institutions of the state, but which was recognized by the United States. And they went further to then seize control of Venezuelan assets, Venezuelan public assets in the United States, especially the company Citgo, a multi-billion-dollar oil company that belongs to the Venezuelan government. They seized control of that, passed it to the Guaido administration that's been wildly corrupt with all the resources they've been showered with by the United States. And on the question of Cuba, the Obama administration never lifted the embargo or blockade on Cuba, of course. However, there was a certain level of easing of certain restrictions on issues like travel and transfers of money, etc., which allowed the American people to rebuild some level of relations with the Cuban people. and which could have been the start of a path towards a much wider normalizations of relations with Cuba. Under the Trump administration, all of that was scrapped. And what we saw was an intensification of the illegal blockade, the economic embargo on Cuba. And just in the past few weeks, there's intensified even more. Now, Western Union, the largest money transfer service in the world, has been forced to pull out of Cuba due to US sanctions. That is catastrophic for the people of Cuba, because Western Union was a way through which families abroad in the United States and other countries could send remittances, something that almost every country of the global south is incredibly reliant on. So to take away people's access to that sort of money, to that sort of income, is something that will have awful consequences for ordinary people in Cuba. Trump has gone on a path of starving Cuban and Venezuelan people into submission. And although these were policies that were present throughout the Obama administration, were policies that massively intensified over the past few years. However, we've got to see what opportunities there can be under the Biden administration. Unfortunately, as every speaker has said, within the US, within the sort of media discourse, there is no bipartisan. There's always been bipartisan consensus around the need for aggressive US policy. And I think it wouldn't be unusual if Joe Biden responds to his sort of crushing defeat in Florida by becoming, even more of an imperialist than Donald Trump. I think it wouldn't be unusual if his advisors, foreign policy advisors, speak in his ear and say that if you want to win back votes in Florida, you're going to have to go even harder than Donald Trump did on Cuba, on Venezuela, on Nicaragua. And what we could see then is an even worse situation for the people of Latin America. But hopefully, that's not something that's written in stone. That's a personal prediction, and I sincerely hope that I'm wrong. But what Latin America really wants is not to stand on one camp or the other. Certainly don't want a new Cold War. What we want is to be able to have to strengthen a multilateral global system in which Latin American countries can interact with both the United States and with China as it sees fit. And Latin America, like everywhere around the world, has been subject to the same threats by the United States, particularly on issues like Huawei. Now, before the coup in Bolivia, Eva Morales was drawing up a number of agreements with China to bring 5G to Bolivia. Bolivia was set to be the center of a 5G revolution in Latin America. Now, something that was being done in coordination with the state telecom company here in Bolivia, Entel. Our friends who worked, public sector workers during that period, and were working on this deal. However, when the coup took place, one of the first demands of the United States was to sweep away the beginnings of the agreement and ensure that Bolivia, like the rest of Latin America, stays in the dark technologically. So what countries like Bolivia will be looking for in this coming period is to be able to restore working relations with China without being threatened by the United States, because that's something that's going to naturally occur. Almost every country in Latin America already has China as their largest trade partner rather than the US. In the past few years, China has completely displaced in that regard. So what Latin America needs is the space to be able to build its own foreign policy. And that's something that the Chinese model, the Chinese approach to foreign affairs offers the world. China doesn't commit. Certainly China has its allies around the world. China being great friends like Venezuela, like Cuba. However, in no part of Latin America or the world does China impose its own culture, its own way of, its own forms of government, its own ways of doing things. China is a country that has relations with both Venezuela and with Colombia. Very, very close, especially commercial relations. Now, one could say that maybe China shouldn't be doing it. Maybe China should be like during the last Cold War, like the role of the Soviet Union in promoting left-wing movements in Latin America and coming out hard against right-wing governments in the region. However, I think that would be a violation of China's stated mission in the world, which is not to impose itself on anyone, is to have good cooperative relations for the mutual benefit of all the peoples of the world. So I think that approach by China of non-interference, of building commercial ties, mutually beneficial commercial ties, is a model that can provide a future for countries, especially developing countries. However, obviously that model has clashed against the US model that sees Latin America as its backyard, that doesn't see Latin America as sovereign, independent nations as China does, but rather sees it as subjects in which no other country should have a presence, whether that be Russia or China.
Hi, Ollie,
So
could you just bring your remarks to 10 minutes?
No, that's that's all I had to say. I hope this future can bring out that space for countries like Bolivia to build an independent path to development.
Okay, right. I'm sorry I have to interrupt people, but we've got to fit in all the speakers. The next speaker is going to be Professor Radhika Desai, who's the professor at the Department of Political Studies in the University of Manitoba, and also the editor of book series of highly good books by Manchester University Press. So over to Radhika. You're muted, Radhika. Unmute yourself.
Right. Yes, thank you very much, John, and thanks very much to the Chongyang Institute, to No Cold War, and to the Tricontinental for organizing this, and to all the organizers who put in a lot of work. It's a great privilege to speak in this company of such important critical thinkers, and also, of course, to speak to the Chinese and the international audience. The US elections, the protracted agony that they have set the United States on is, I feel, merely another milestone in the decades-long unraveling of the United States neoliberal and financialized capitalism and its consequent decline in world influence. As the US passes this milestone, it sees China with its contrasting economic model, complete with contrasting economic performance and pandemic performance, headed in the other direction, rising as the US is declining. This is the essential background against which to appreciate the US elections and their aftermath. Domestically, China's contrasting success against the pandemic, its economic dynamism, its political stability are the mirrors in which the US's pandemic failures, economic debility, and political unraveling, as well as decline in international influence, are reflected most plainly. The elections 2020 are only further deepening the crisis of ungovernability that led to Trump's election 4 years ago in the first place. Over the past 40 years, US governments of both parties have promoted neoliberalism and financialization, which have worsened inequality, insecurity, productive weakness, and social polarization among the US electorate on the one hand, and on the other, sought to win votes for them at the same time. The political contradictions of this configuration generated were maturing over the neoliberal decades, when they began sharpening even more rapidly after the 2008 North Atlantic financial crisis. The present dynamic, pandemic and the crisis only gives them an even more razor-sharp edge. It's clear that Biden will be proclaimed the winner and Trump will have a barrage of court cases, which will, however, probably unlikely to overturn the verdict. If it does so, the US's problems that I'm about to describe will be even worse. The dominant interpretation of Biden's victory has been that it will save democracy. All the media is proclaiming this. However, the details reveal a different picture. As many people have pointed out, Biden's victory has been exceedingly narrow. And in fact, if he has won the most votes in US election history, Trump has won the second most votes, and the margin between them on last Friday was about 2%, not huge. It gets worse for Biden. Most Trump voters were devoted to him and his policies, despite his repulsive personality, grotesque underperformance on the pandemic, and unenviable economic record. By contrast, Biden voters, as Claudia pointed out, did not vote for him. They voted to get Trump out. Despite overwhelming support for Biden in the media, despite him bending over backwards to appeal to the Trump voter, and despite out-fundraising Trump by a factor of 2 to 1 and making the Democratic Party more plutocratic than ever. All these exertions have left US 2020 elections more dominated by Trump than ever, and the US polity more divided than ever. Worse, Trump will preside over a polity divided between devoted Trump supporters and those who desperately wanted and needed an alternative, but only got the restoration of the very conditions that led to the election of Trump. Never was a victory more Pyrrhic. What can winning the right to govern the ungovernable possibly be? The US crisis of governability has also shaken its institutional foundations. Biden claimed that the US military would usher Trump out of office if he refused to leave, only to be contradicted by the Chief of Defense Staff refusing to accept the commission. The rushed appointment of Coney Barrett has raised doubts about the impartiality of the US judiciary that will remain whether Biden packs the court or not. The media has violated its own vocation to merely report the news and has taken instead to making the news instead. The Electoral College is now thoroughly discredited, but it is also clear that replacing it is harder than ever. While American citizens are very proud of the antiquity of their Constitution, they now realize that you cannot run a 21st century society with an 18th century Constitution. And they have also therefore realized one of the reasons they love the Constitution is that it has been changed so little. But the fact is, it's been changed so little because it's very hard to change, and it's very hard to change because the framers never trusted the people. The Republican Party is already in a situation of tearing itself apart. Basically, the Republican Party had to take Trump because it couldn't find anything better, and now people are already beginning to break ranks. At the same time, the Democratic Party is also deeply divided between Biden's neoliberal current and a small left that is acutely aware of the need to break with the neoliberalism of the past, even though it's not quite sure exactly how to do so. Civil war remains a lurid fear rather than a realistic possibility. Instead, with the Senate remaining in Republican hands, the US faces a prolonged and paralyzing gridlock between a decaying capitalism and a restive citizenry that it can neither satisfy nor pacify, and which is likely to take a long time before it can organize to refashion this unsatisfactory state of affairs. This sort of United States will alternate between being preoccupied with its internal problems and being internationally provocative in order to distract attention from them. Biden may bring some superficial changes, such as rejoining the WHO or the Paris Accord, or even reviving the Iran nuclear deal. However, like Democrats before him, he will remain a creature of the State and Defense Department establishments, which originated the hostility towards China, and of course, which have historically been very aggressive towards any attempt by any society to organize its affairs on a basis that is different and incompatible with what United States and its capitalist classes need. So essentially, they are all committed to the present pattern of a neoliberal financialized capitalist economy. We mustn't forget, of course, that the Obama administration had essentially took over many members of the Bush Jr. administration into its own cabinet, particularly relating to defense and the Treasury. Biden would love to carry forward the traditional Democratic program of combining militarism with expanding the options of US capitalists. However, he faces a number of countercurrents. he will need to pander to the same constituency of discontents of neoliberalism as Trump. And that is to say, he will have to bend over backwards to do things like buy America and be hostile towards China because he has no other program for them. So in that sense, this would be less, expanding opportunities for the American capitalist class will be less possible for him than it was for Obama. There is also the historic American tradition of trying to preserve technological advantage via intellectual property rather than continuous innovation. And this is also a strategy that has already failed against China and will continue to do so. While major elements of the US ruling classes recognize that it must come to terms with China's rising power, their political representatives cannot win elections without making China the scapegoat for the ills that their system generates, that their structure of power and privilege generates. This is what the new Cold War has always been about. Like the old Cold War, it is already generating pressures on other countries to line up on one side or the other. As it happens, it is clear that only the most roguish regimes, India and Brazil, the governments of India and Brazil today come to mind most readily, will line up alongside the United States. The only thing China must do is remain open, as it already does, is remain open to reasonable dialogue, befriend the wiser elements of these societies that are ranged against it, and focus its attention on the countries and forces with which it can cooperate in a mutually beneficial development. Given the glaring contrasts between a chaotic US and a stably rising and prospering China, there will be many of the latter type of forces. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Radhika. Right, the next speaker is Sean Kang from the Chao Collective. Particularly for viewers in China, I would like to explain the significance of the Chao Collective's activities, perhaps a little. The American media and the Western media, of course, has always been open to those of Chinese heritage who want to attack China, no matter how inaccurate their views are. I mean, Gordon Chang, for example, or anybody whose views are continually disproved and nevertheless presented as China experts. A new development is those of Chinese heritage in the West who are speaking out to support China and explain the objective reality about China. And one of the most effective with a real social media presence has been the Chao Collective. So I'm very, very pleased to hand over the floor to Sean Kang to speak.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much, John. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, John, for that rousing introduction. And we're very honored to be here. Thank you so much to the organizers for having us among this international crowd. As John said, we, the Chao Collective, are a group of Chinese diaspora in the West, committed to anti-imperialism and socialism. Many of us are actually Chinese Americans. This topic really speaks to the core of our identities. And to be totally blunt, these elections mean very little to us, because the United States has never stopped being hostile to China and the Chinese people, even to those Chinese people living as residents and citizens within their own borders. Although Chinese and Chinese Americans are indeed citizens and residents in different countries, our destinies are ultimately linked. And through our experiences rife here with the suffering at the hands of this imperialist, we hold that the threat of the new Cold War remains unmitigated regardless of who wins this election. A Biden presidency indeed promises to return to normal, and that normal of what? Pretty sounding words, full of aspirations of a vibrant democracy towards a law-based international order with respect for human rights. A Biden presidency has already promised to restore America's place on the world stage. I beg the audience's indulgence as I come from a little bit more particular angle in this discussion to share a little bit as a Chinese American about how we fare under this normal, under all these years of such lofty words and what these words mean to us as Chinese Americans committed to anti-imperialism and socialism. As Chinese Americans, we live in a country that promises liberty and justice for all, but it's becoming more and more clear that that trust is misplaced and has been grossly betrayed throughout the years. One needs only to look at the history of our time here from the very early days to see that this is the case. In the 19th century, particularly on the West Coast, it was us Chinese Americans who built the railroads, who tilled the land for fertile farmlands and built the cities. And how were we rewarded for that? With exclusion, with the denial of basic rights, such as the right to testify at court, and even with ethnic cleansing. The audience surely knows the man Qian Xiesun, whose contribution to American science cannot be overstated, who co-founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And how was he rewarded? With imprisonment at the height of McCarthyism, that age of paranoia driven by the loss of China. And of course, in today's tech boom that the Americans enjoy, the Chinese Americans have also played a not insignificant role. Yet we are thanked by increasing charges of espionage and witch hunts, which only grow more severe day by day. No, Chinese Americans are not the ones to receive justice in this country. When Vincent Chin was murdered in Michigan, his 2 murderers got probation, because apparently that is the worth of a Chinese life in this country. In the 2008 global financial crisis, a crisis recognized to have been caused by the irresponsible practices of American banks, the only bank to be criminally prosecuted in the United States was Abacus Bank, a Chinese American-owned family bank based in Chinatown. And just like in the 19th century, we are now blamed for the China flu, for the China disease, for Kung flu. With current hate crime numbers spiking, from March to June, 2,128 incidents reported against Asian Americans in connection with COVID. Just as constantly as us Chinese Americans are used, abused, and betrayed by the United States, so it is constant that xenophobia and anti-China policies prevail with bipartisan support. It was under Clinton, a Democrat, that the Chinese embassy in Belgrade was bombed. It was under Bush, a Republican, that the United States began to host certain governments and exiles and their affiliated organizations, hoping to foment separatism within China. And it was under Obama, a Democrat, that despite Chinese cooperation in stabilizing the global economy after the financial crisis, the United States chose to militarize the Western Pacific under its pivot to Asia. And of course, it was under Obama that the NSA hacked Huawei and the United States increased its interference in Hong Kong, with both issues obviously coming to a head under Republican Trump. And of course, all administrations criticized China on environmental issues, even though it was the United States that exported waste and trash to China. This all shows the actual relationship the United States desires with China, a purely exploitative one, in which the United States may extract Chinese labor, wealth, and resources at will. And this definition extends to the earliest days of the relationship. The illicit opium trade in 19th century China created a new class of fabulously wealthy Americans, whose benefactors include Harvard University, the Delano family of Franklin Delano Roosevelt fame, and the Forbes family, of whom former Secretary of State John Forbes Carey is a descendant. Today, the United States merely seeks the same goal. I mean, the United States was satisfied when China was making cheap toys for export to the United States. This is simply the pillaging nature of the country known as the United States, which, after all, is built on a stolen continent, built with stolen labor, of which Chinese people have played a role. Yet it is not enough that the United States seeks to exploit the Chinese people. When the Chinese people stand up, the United States gets angry and deploys egregious violence. In the war against American aggression in Korea, after suffering defeat at the hands of a new People's Republic, the United States resorted to biological and chemical warfare against the Chinese and Korean people, with some authorities even considering nuclear attacks. The same nuclear threat hung over other conflicts in Asia, including Vietnam and Straits crises. It is telling that the United States is so cavalier about nuclear use when the target is Asians or Pacific Islanders. It is very clear from this history that no matter whether us Chinese people are in the United States or outside of it, we are not human to the imperialists, but rather instruments to be used, abused, and destroyed at will. And us Chinese Americans know very well the consequences of looking like the enemy. For in the height of World War II, the United States threw 120,000 Japanese Americans into concentration camps for the simple sin of being Japanese. If that was not enough, the United States ordered 2,264 citizens and permanent residents of 12 Latin American countries, of these 1,800 Peruvians, into these concentration camps. Again, for no other sin than to be Japanese. And this is all ruled legal and constitutional by the Supreme Court. All this suffering, all this hardship, and for what? Fresh air and freedom, as somebody once put it. Real wages, as has been pointed out, has stagnated in this country for 40, 50 years. And we Chinese Americans are largely such average Americans. In fact, Asian Americans are one of the groups hardest hit by unemployment due to the COVID crisis. Make no mistake, this is a new McCarthyism, a new age of injustice, a new Cold War. And it was coming regardless of who wins, who won this election. Because these are not problems that began with Trump. And these are not problems that will end with Biden, no matter how many beautiful words he and others like him will use. Because for us as Chinese Americans, these are problems that began when the colonists first arrived on this continent, proceeding to massacre and dispossess an entire continent of people, destroying entire ecologies and environments, and building up their country with slave labor and gross betrayal of their own professed values. For us as Chinese Americans, these are problems that began when the imperialists destroyed our ancestral homeland in the 19th century. We don't see the character of the United States changing anytime soon, because history teaches us that we have always been its enemies, either to be crushed and killed or to be used and exploited. The only time Chinese people are accepted by the United States is when they act as its mouthpiece, praising its supposed freedom and superior political system, validating criticisms and attacks against China. The audience is surely familiar with these types of Chinese diaspora, but please know that these people, loud as they might be perched on their platform given to them, do not represent the working Chinese American, those who labor long and hard hours at low-paying jobs, live in poor housing and downtrodden environments, and constantly face state violence. In this light, Chao's role and mission does not change with any election. We seek not only to oppose imperialism and war against China and to resist this new Cold War, but to work hand in hand with our comrades here to effect actual justice in this land, which has eluded this continent since the first days of this country. Thank you again so much for having us. It's been an honor.
Thank you very much indeed, Sean. I think following on your remarks, this would be an appropriate point at which to announce and make clear that the next event of No Cold War, which is next Saturday on the 14th of November, is on racism and the new Cold War, because the two are integrally linked, because in order to carry on aggressive policies, it's necessary to spread racist ideology against an increasing number of groups. And there are already enough people who have been subject to racist attacks even before that, but new ones can always be added if you have that way of thinking. Right, our next speaker is Professor John Foster, who's the Emeritus Professor of Social Sciences at the University of the West of Scotland. He's the author of many classic books on British history, but he's always also a determined student of international affairs, and I'm highly delighted to introduce him. So the floor is yours, John.
First of all, can you excuse me for not having my video on? Unfortunately, my camera is broken on the computer, but I hope you can hear me nonetheless. So thank you very much to the organizers. This organization plays a vital role organizationally and in Britain in attempting to rally people to oppose the new Cold War. And in terms of answering the questions, I will not have much to say that will add to what has already been said by Wang Wen, by John Ross, by Martin Jakes, and by others. A Biden victory will indeed change the new Cold War, but it won't stop it. The US approach is likely to become more sophisticated, comprehensive, but also dangerous. I want to focus on three questions. First, on Biden himself. Second, on China, and third, on Britain. Is there a potential role for progressive forces in Britain to oppose this war? Where can they be based, and can they be strengthened? On Biden, I think enough has been said. He is rooted in the US State Department establishment. He served under Clinton and Obama, but he did so dangerously. He was always the hawk under Clinton, pushing for NATO intervention in the Balkans. He was a hawk under Obama, closely involved with Victoria Nuland in planning the coup in Ukraine. and then pushing unsuccessfully for NATO retaliation in the Crimea, an enormously dangerous thing. And he is today a hawk on China, as everybody knows, seeing China in highly ideological terms as a totalitarian challenge, and seeking to confront China in the South China Sea, on Hong Kong, in Tibet, and Xinjiang. His approach will therefore be more sophisticated, ideological, and long-term than Trump's, and in particular seek to base it within wider alliances. This makes it particularly dangerous. Biden aims to rebuild US ties with the European Union and to redevelop US leadership within the NATO alliance, and do so very much more on ideological terms as defender of the world's free market democracies, as he will state them. He will seek to assert US leadership on climate change and revert to Obama's policies in the Middle East and revive, probably, though not necessarily, the nuclear deal with Iran. He may well also back away from Trump's alignment with the most reactionary forces in both Israel and the Gulf states, although that very much remains to be seen. And it will be on this basis, as a champion of the liberal free world, that Biden will continue the new Cold War. And he will pose it in terms very much of democracy against totalitarianism, not in terms of economic competition and a square deal like Trump. He may well revive earlier State Department perspectives of seeking to exploit internal divisions within Chinese society around these issues. And on past record, he will do so dangerously. Russia will also be a target, probably with Belarus in the front line. The issue will be posed there also as democracy against totalitarianism, and with the newly re-established alliance with the EU being used to strengthen expansionist economic ambitions in both Eastern Europe and also in Africa. So we face a very dangerous future and no immediate end to the new Cold War. So what of China and China's role? The question of a Thucydides trap has been posed repeatedly, and as what makes war a rising possibility. I think there may be a danger of being trapped by the term itself, because the term and its author derives from the US State Department, from the US policy establishment. Graham Allison was a Defense Department advisor during a number of administrations, but particularly during the dismantling of the Soviet Union. He is likely to argue for a similar approach today, and his advice will be to strengthen those seeking an ideological challenge to exploit divisions within Chinese society, to use wider international agreements to push for opening China's economy even more in ways that would disrupt the overall socialist direction of that economy, and to unite the NATO alliance on these ideological terms. It will be offered in the spirit of avoiding war, but together with Biden's past record, it makes for a very dangerous ideological and political combination. And of course, the Athens-Sparta analogy is a very false one, probably deliberately, because it obscures a key reality. Athens and Sparta were both slave societies, both had colonial empires and alliances that stretched across the Mediterranean. This is not the case with the US and China. One is seeking to build a socialist society, the other to sustain a capitalist one. And a capitalist one based, as we have heard from many speakers today, on the subordination of the global economy, on the control of international capital markets, and sustained by the international primacy of the dollar. It is indeed a failing society, plagued by extreme inequality and technological dominance that is now largely limited to IT, aerospace, and military technology. And it is one that depends internationally on the harshest forms of political and military intervention in the Americas, in Africa, in the Middle East, and Asia. There is therefore a direct and strong contrast with China. China needs peace. It is committed to peace. Its economic dynamism depends on its internal economy. It seeks joint development with its economic partners. It does not depend on exploitative relations or military force. And no less important, as President Xi has stressed, China now foregrounds its socialist character, the country's objective of developing a modern socialist society over the next 2 decades. And this, I think, is very important. In the aftermath of COVID and the current juncture of global development, we see the balance of forces and ideologies quite differently from what it was in the late 1980s and 1990s when Graham Allison and his colleagues in the US Defense Department were supporting the neoliberal transformation of Russia and Eastern Europe. I think Martin Jakes has eloquently portrayed what has happened over the subsequent 3 decades. On the other hand, China's economy is indeed dynamic. According to the IMF World Report for October, it will have grown by 10% over the next 2 years. And by contrast, the United States economy will have contracted by at least 1.2% over that period, not grown at all. And those of its potential allies in Europe will have shrunk by even more. There is every prospect that the unprecedented levels of debt within the capitalist world will result in even lower growth rates and greater crisis than in the decade after 2010. And it's not just a matter of economics. China's ability to survive the pandemic, as I think more and more people are seeing, and to do so without major economic loss, is a direct result of the character of its political system and its orientation. Because we have also seen a similar ability in other socialist-oriented societies, such as Vietnam and Cuba. China and its mass communist party has been able to mobilize social resources in a way quite unlike that in the United States or Britain or in the EU. All these countries have been ravaged by a decade of neoliberal austerity, by growing social inequality, by a loss of social provision, and driven by a capitalist imperative to maintain production, often in medically hazardous conditions. So this is not to say that a threat from a new Cold War on Biden's terms can be minimized, because China is strong. The expectations and character of Biden and his political project make it in some ways more dangerous than that of Trump. Economic parity between the United States and China will be reached sooner now as a result of the pandemic, and the consequential effects on dollar primacy will be seen within the current decade. That, I think, is why, for internationalists across the globe, President Xi's emphasis on peace and socialism is particularly important, that the two are insolubly linked. It rallies the potential of an international understanding that we are dealing with 2 different social systems, and does so at a time when the contradictions within the capitalist order will become particularly stark. It has the potential of rallying, therefore, a much broader and socially profound and genuinely mass-based counter-alliance to that of Joe Biden, and doing so on the basis of peace and coexistence. To come to Britain, finally.
Draw your remarks to a close, please.
Okay, I will, yeah. Biden spells bad news for the current Conservative administration that has been very close ideologically to Trump. And Biden has spoken out against Johnson's government's position on Ireland and the Irish border, and more fundamentally and strategically, Biden wants closer relations with the United States, with the EU, at a time when Johnson and his government is in conflict with it. So this is a time when Britain's economy is itself weak and among those worst hit by the COVID pandemic. And the Johnson government will undoubtedly seek to reinvigorate its links with the US under Biden, but it will face very significant objective obstacles. I don't think I can continue within the time that I have to make the arguments that I wanted to make about the ways in which there can be the opportunity for rallying the forces within Britain against a new Cold War. There are objective difficulties in terms of the Labour Party currently, and in terms of a trade union movement that is unfortunately fighting for jobs, and where much of the British economy and its advanced sectors are linked into a military-industrial complex. There are real difficulties here. But on the other hand, there are opportunities, particularly, I think, within the regions and nations of Britain, of developing an alternative political perspective that could be compatible with much closer economic links with China under the leadership of administrations in the regions and in Scotland and in Wales that are politically distinct from that of Johnson. And that is an area, I think, which is something that needs to be examined for the future. Okay, apologies for taking a little longer than I should.
Right. Okay. Right. Fine. I'm going to give the final word to Wang Wen to sum up, but I just want to deal with a few small matters before that. Firstly, to thank the technical team and the translators, because it's no small thing to put on a event in both English and Chinese, and it's a rare privilege to be able to speak simultaneously to both an English language and a Chinese audience. I would make myself just two final remarks. As I work in a Chinese institute, as I said at the beginning, I would have liked this message that we were able to say is that the defeat of Trump means the end of the new Cold War, but I think all our speakers, I'm afraid, convey the message that it doesn't, and you can't avoid harsh realities. That's very important situation. Secondly, because I work in a Chinese institution, I know what the response of China will be. China will not seek confrontation with the United States, doesn't want confrontation with the United States. China will concentrate on the development of China. And of course, our Chinese colleagues have spoken much more about that than I have. If we had time, and I hope no Cold War will perhaps deal with it, would be to study the new 5-year plan of China, which doesn't deal with how to confront the United States. It deals with how to build a high-income economy in China. That's what it deals with. Finally, I will give the final summary to Wang Wen, and to thank Chongyang Institute very much for making it possible for us to have a dual language event, and hope that it was interest to everybody. Okay, over to you finally, Wang Wen.
Okay. Okay, John. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone. So actually, I shared very good news to everyone that tonight in of Beijing time, there are over 10,000 audience listening, Chinese audience listening to our comments on U.S.-China relationship as well as the Cold War, and then in Twitter, in YouTube, there are also a lot of audience to listen to us. I think this is a very successful event, and we can communicate each other and we learn each other. So thank you, John. Thank you, Martin, as well as all my international friends. Very brief summary. Tonight, I really learned a lot. The most important feeling tonight is that I had more confidence about the future of China-US relationship. there are three reasons. First, China and the United States economy now are very interdependent, and there is no power to decouple the two countries. The so-called Cold War, as some of you said, that is not the interest of the two peoples. In China, no one would like to have a Cold War with the US. That's the first. Secondly, that most of people in the world do not want a Cold War now. If the Cold War between US and China happened, it will certainly affect the international economic development and the actual lifestyle of most vast majority of the people in the world. This is second. Third, China and the US have to learn to coexist. China is no longer the original China, and the US is no longer the original US. So both countries should realize that United States does not have the strength to deter China's development, China's rise. Because as we all know, there are 1.4 billion people in China, and everyone, including me, wants a better life. So which is inevitably form a strong driving force for the country's development. And China is not willing to take over the leadership of the United States. So just kidding. In fact, in China, many or most of people feel that it is very, very time to be an international leader, which is a joke that, okay, let Americans do such a tiring job, right? So that's true. In Chinese gene, we have no any mind to want to lead the world instead of United States. So in the future, the best mentality of China and the US is the cooperation. So we should cooperate with each other to develop our own countries and make the world better and better. So in sum, we need unity and we need help each other. So this is our responsibility and our interest for ourselves and for the next generation, as well as all the people in the world. So that's all. I think that this is a very, very successful event, and I suggest that in the future we can continue to cooperate and often organize the event like tonight. So thank you all. Thank you, John. Thank you, Sean, and everyone. Thank you.
Okay. Right. Thank you very much. That brings everything to a close. Just one final thing. Don't please forget that next Saturday, there will be the event of No Cold War, which you can get on nocoldwar.org on uniting against racism and the new Cold War. So I hope, particularly if you've liked today, you'll join us for that. Thank everybody very much indeed. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
See.